through the entire service without our presence being known and the fullness of the Unzagas being present in this service. So I thank you for all of your hospitality and for your understanding. Certainly that's been my experience as I've been here, not only over these past few months, but even while I was supplying when Pastor Kristen was out for bereavement and during different circumstances, I always felt very welcomed and that this was a very warm community. So thank you for extending that hospitality towards me as a guest preacher. As you all may remember, I train chaplains to do pastoral care in the hospital setting. And every so often, I will hear the comment from students that I train, this work is so hard. I don't know how you do this every day. And part of it is their own lament about how difficult it is to go into hospital rooms and sit with pain. But then there's also that real reality that doing it day in and day out can wear on you. The work indeed is very hard. Hospital chaplains respond to crises along with the rest of the team, the doctors and the nurses. But we go to a place where doctors and nurses don't necessarily go. Many times we'll have doctors kind of turn to us when the family is overcome with grief and say, well, you take over now. We specialize in supporting those who are grieving once there is nothing left to be done. It's probably not exactly many people's cup of tea. I remember that first time when someone said to me, I'm not sure how you do this, and it wasn't a student actually. It was early on in my training when I was working at a private hospital in Brooklyn, and I was covering the hospital during one of those 24-hour on-call shifts. And so I received a call early in the morning, about 2 a.m., woke up, and I arrived in the ICU to find an elderly woman seated next to her husband in the ICU. She was all alone, which is somewhat unusual, and she shared some of her story with me, that she had no children, no family really, and the only person that she had was her husband. Her husband of over 40 years, who was critically ill. He was her whole life. After talking for a while, we said a prayer, and not much longer afterwards, he drew his final breath. After sitting with her for more time as she sat with him, she didn't ask any questions about logistics, which is kind of the mode that some people go into. They want to know what are the next steps, what are the arrangements they need to do. She sat silently there, and then she asked me, how do I leave? We walked silently from the ICU to the front of the hospital, where she got into a cab. Disoriented and overwhelmed with grief, there wasn't much left to say. She wouldn't have heard any words of comfort anyway. She was exhausted. As she left, I remember her turning to me and she said, I don't know how you do this. This is a hard gig, this thing that you do. Then she turned and, heartbroken, she climbed into the cab alone. Unfortunately, if you live long enough, you do the hard work of grief. You don't have to be a chaplain. I'm aware that within this congregation that there are lots of people who are struggling with illness. Even though I'm not doing the pastoral care visits, I'm aware that things have been arising. And your community has been holding that grief, holding that anxiety, holding that sadness. You don't have to be a chaplain to encounter. We all suffer loss if we live long enough. This is a hard lesson to learn. And we've all looked grief in the face, and we have all bemoaned it. Grief is not a place where we like to sit. It's not a convenient place to go in a sermon. It's not uplifting. It's not a place that we really want to dwell. And yet this is exactly where we text today. There's no avoiding it. There's no escaping it. There he is. He's walking with his friends, and he encounters it. If you remember from the text from last week, Jesus was sought out by some messengers sent from a Roman centurion requesting that Jesus heal the soldier's servant. The message was sent out in faith. It was a plea for help, a reverent acknowledgement of Jesus' power. The soldier was asking for help the way that many of us do right when we're in the midst of illness. We're in that place of asking for some divine deliverance. The soldier is asking for help in that the help of emotionally and spiritually and physically debilitating circumstances. He's sending out a prayer, an SOS. This centurion offered a prayer for help, and Jesus answered him. Now, as Jesus continues traveling, he encounters a different situation, one in which there are no messengers who are pleading for help because there is nothing left to be done. Instead, Jesus comes across this situation as he is traveling, he's walking, and they're out on the outskirts of the city where someone in the Palestinian tradition would have been buried. They're out in the margins of society. And there they encounter the funeral procession. There's nothing left to be done. So the attention turns towards the woman in the story, the woman who has lost everything. Now, we don't know a lot about her. We don't even really know about her emotional state. The text doesn't tell us a lot. But what we do know is absolutely heartbreaking. She's a widow, so her husband has died. She has no financial means, therefore, because in that day and age, her financial sustenance would be with her husband. And then, to add insult to injury, because she's lost her only heir, her only son, anything that she did possess would have been returned right back to her husband's family. She literally has nothing left. Any semblance of financial stability and security had vanished. Now, the financial situation is a reality, and that also happens in our day and age. When we lose someone, that financial stress can pop up in the midst of all of our grief. How will she survive after this? But at a deeper level, it's hard to look at this woman for a different reason. It's hard to look at this woman because of the sheer magnitude of her loss. She not only lost her husband, now she's lost her son. She has no one. They are both gone forever. It's overwhelming. It's too much to bear. And this is exactly where our beloved and fair Jesus enters the scene. There's no indication that she knew who Jesus was. There's no indication that she was reaching out for him for help like we see in so many other stories. She might not even be aware of who Jesus is. She might not even be aware that he's standing among her. He sees her. He sees her. He doesn't turn away. And he initiates the encounter. The text says that he had compassion for her. Now, the fact that he had compassion on her is not hard to comprehend. That's something that all of us would duly understand. That's something that we would hope for ourselves, that Jesus would look upon us and would have compassion. But in the Greco-Roman culture of that day, it would have been seen as a sign of weakness to be moved to compassion. Is that so different from our day and age? A lot has been written and talked about lately. It's very a la mode to talk about vulnerability, thanks to the very important work of researcher, professor, and social worker Brene Brown. Many of you may have seen her TED Talks. They're among the most viewed TED Talks on the web, in which she talks about the importance of acknowledging and working through shame to really live into relationships and connection and vitality. In another video that's not as popular as the TED Talks, I think it's had like 14 million views. But another video that's floating around the web, she actually talks about her journey of returning back to the church and returning back to a life of faith. In it, she names the hardest emotions to work through as grief and shame. And she, in the midst of this breakdown that she so famously talks about, she says she went back to church around that same time, thinking that going back to church would be kind of like a spiritual epidural. It would be like she's coming back to church, and then all of this pain and all of this shame that she had not been confronting for years, it would make that pain go away. She thought that the life of faith would simply erase the hardship that we face. And it's not an unusual thing to believe, right? We hear that even preached from the pulpit. But what she says about it is, instead of it being like an epidural, she found that faith became a midwife. That amidst all of the groaning that happens with grief, that the midwife was there to help bear the grief. What has faith meant for you in the midst of crisis? Is this something that even rings true? The text says, when the Lord saw her, he had compassion for her, and he said, "Do not weep." Then he came forward and he touched the bier, and he said, "Young man, I say to you, rise." We are reminded in this text of the power of the name of God, Emmanuel, God with us. Today, as we see Jesus moved by compassion, Jesus shows up in the outskirts of town, in the middle of nowhere, steps into the middle of the situation where many other people would have just kept on walking or turned the other way. He walks right into the situation. He sees the woman's grief, and he restores that boy to life. Now, what does that mean for us in our present day? When, of course, we wish for that outcome in so many instances. We wish that those who we've lost would instantly be restored to life. And yet that's not how it plays out, is it? The power of this story is that we learn that death is not the end of the story. Jesus enters into that pain with us, bears with us, has compassion on us, and shows us that death does not have that final word. In fact, in the midst of death, Jesus shows us the depth of his true love, that he enters into it with us, he stands with us, he bears with us, he shows love, and he cares for us. And he even restores us. Vice President Joe Biden recently wrote a letter to his 12-year-old self. Some of you might have seen it on CBS. And he reflected on and interwove his experiences between his political life and his personal life. Many of you may know that just after he became the youngest elected senator ever, he faced a severe tragedy in his life. His wife and his daughter died in a car crash, and his two young boys were very seriously injured. And then those two sons who he lived for and pulled things together for and raised by himself, one of those two surviving sons died of cancer recently. It's an overwhelming grief, one that would swallow anyone with pain. And yet he writes with hope to his 12-year-old self. He says, "One day you'll be on the top of the world, only to be brought down in a flash with a profound loss and grief that leaves a black hole in your heart, questions of faith in your soul, and anger beyond rage. But that's when you'll dig deep. You'll hold on to faith and pure grit, because a family grounded in unconditional love and loyalty and the compassion of friends and strangers. You'll get up, And you'll keep going and you'll get back. That's the power of this pain that we encounter, the power of Jesus entering into our midst, that in it we are not alone. And then, out of living through these experiences, we give back to others. We support others. We live through these things with others. In the midst of crisis, we learn that we are not alone. Amidst the difficult emotions, Jesus sees us. Jesus enters into the pain. Jesus has compassion on us. Jesus promises that death is not the end. Where are you longing for restoration today? How has God been present with you in that longing? With Jesus and with each other, we face trials together. And we hold on to this promise that this great prophet, this great rabbi, but more than anything, this great friend will not turn away from us. Jesus sees us at our most vulnerable. He reaches out his hand to restore us, even if we are not looking at him. In the name of the one who was, and is to come.